Hello, I'm Dan Jurgen, and welcome to CERAWeek Conversations brought to you by IHS Markit. Very pleased today to be talking with Ben van Beurden, the CEO of Royal Dutch Shell. We'll be talking about operating in the COVID era, about the oil and gas markets and energy markets after COVID, and also about Shell's plans and ambitions to be a net zero carbon company by 2050. So we have a lot to talk about, and Ben, welcome to the conversation. Thank you for being here.
See you again, Dan.
Yeah. Ben, maybe I'll start by just asking, was the oil and gas industry prepares for many contingencies? Was a pandemic in the planning for the industry?
That's a good question, actually. I was reflecting only recently that I remember from probably the SARS days that we had pandemic very clearly in our risk matrix. But I think we looked at it much more from a business continuity perspective. And yes, I would say we have prepared for a pandemic or for disruption at the scale that we are seeing at the moment, very much successfully also from a business continuity perspective. But of course, it was always going to be difficult to assess what was going to happen to the economy. And right. For that, I believe, we were not prepared, and certainly not in the sort of short notice that this pandemic then washed over us.
Right. So how have you reorganized work to run a global business?
Well, it's a lot of things are, of course, fundamentally different, but a lot of things also haven't changed, really. Of course, we tend to focus a little bit on, the offices are closed and people are working from home, and we now are even more reliant on IT, and we feel good about the fact that it all works, and it does. We have thousands, tens of thousands of people, of course, in back offices doing all the operational activities that keep the company going, and that has worked remarkably well. But the other thing, of course, you have to bear in mind is that most of our people work actually in facilities, and of course our facilities haven't shut down. They are integral to the working of the economy, and therefore we probably have had to put at least as much attention on how do we continue to operate our facilities well, how do we look after our staff, and that of course has been a major challenge as well. But also that has worked, and credit to everybody in the company and around us who has made that, as far as I can tell, a very, very resounding success.
So in terms of the operating the facilities, has there been certain governing principles that you have used to make those facilities work and keep people safe?
Yeah, of course, we have facilities in so many different countries. And then, of course, it's not just the upstream facilities or our refineries or our chemical plants, LNG plants, it's ships that move around the world. It's, of course, retail facilities, of which we have an awful lot. So you have to follow the rules of the country in which you operate. And we followed quite a, shall we say, sort of global structure that we tend to use for crisis management. But, of course, this is like a little bit of a slow burn crisis, but where we remain very much coordinated across the company, very much try to understand what to learn from one country, apply in the next country, how you use also the local context to maximum effect. Lots of measures being taken, as you can imagine, to the social distancing and how you make sure that everything is safe, what you do if you have an infection. And I think that part has all, as I said, worked quite well. The biggest worry I had then, to be perfectly honest, was how do you actually keep facilities running for a long time without the quite detailed oversight that we tend to have over the operation? So how do you make sure that our technical controls, management of change, permit to work, license and permitting conditions, etc., do not gradually deteriorate without us actually being on top of it all the time? But also there, I'm very, very heartened that so far we haven't seen anything slip or erode.
So that must have been, you obviously had to develop new processes or new ways of communicating to assure those operations.
Yeah. And sometimes it is, of course, as, shall we say, high level as how do you do an audit on a facility if you can't visit it anymore? And a lot of the focus then needs to go to, well, doing a few things, of course, virtually or offline, but putting more focus on the first and second lines of defense for verification and audit on the facility itself. But you also have the challenges, of course, that many of our operations that involve, say, for instance, specialists traveling in or special expertise being involved, it has to be redone in a different way. In some cases, it can't be done, but in many cases, we found that actually you can do an awful lot virtually if there is really no alternative. And in many cases, we have found out that it actually works just as well, or maybe even better.
Oh, better. That's interesting.
Well, imagine you are on a facility very far away, the other side of the world. You have to have a person fly in for some issue that you have. That person may be on their way for a day, look at things, go back, sort of work things out with their office. But now, all of a sudden, if you can do this with cameras, with robots, with online sort of verification, with actually a team back home to oversee what is happening, sometimes you find that actually that's a superior way of bringing technical expertise in than the conventional sort of physical visit type of way.
Well, I guess one thing that will come out of this when it's over is kind of a reevaluation of what needs to of travel or not travel in terms of, you say, investment of days to get someplace, and should you just do it electronically?
That's right. I think a lot of things will change. I'm sure you're going to ask me this question soon, but
I will come to that.
Will change, but that I don't know. But it's fair to assume that things will work out differently, simply because the necessity of doing it differently actually has sort of led to a new invention, or we find that this is superior, or now that we are doing it differently, we feel that we can perhaps slim down an organization or take out costs more permanently. And therefore, there is also a bit of a silver lining in that respect.
Yeah. So I heard you the other day say that one of the things that maybe has been taken for granted by many people is the remarkable resilience that this industry has shown in terms of continuing to operate and deliver the goods in this environment. And I was quite struck by your comment about that.
Yeah, of course, it's very remarkable if you think of it. A lot of people think of it in terms of the financial resilience, and that is quite remarkable as well, by the way, Dan. If you just see how many companies, of course, have seen a very significant dent appear in their cash flow statement, have to deal with a lot of financial pressures, change investment programs around, et cetera, et cetera. That is quite a remarkable demonstration of resilience in its own right. But I think the even more profound aspect of it is that, of course, we tend to operate a global supply chain that is incredibly interlinked, that relies on an awful lot of just-in-time management of hydrocarbons at the place where it's going to be needed, or energy at a place where it is needed. And what we found, that despite this massive disruption that has taken place in the whole logistics chain, everything has continued to work. Well, it worked perhaps in a different way, but I do not believe anywhere in the world have we seen major shortcomings in the provision of energy or materials that are needed in the supply chain. And that is actually quite a remarkable achievement as well, if you consider how topsy-turvy the market has been for months.
One of the things that strikes me about that resilience is the attitudes towards plastic and how this crisis has changed it. In the book I just delivered to the publisher, I write about a hospital operating room, how much of it depends upon plastic, and of course for sanitation and health. And I just wonder if you felt a shift in the attitudes towards plastics because of the important role they play in terms of dealing with the COVID crisis.
I think you can intellectually make that case, I think, Dan, that indeed the attitudes must have changed. People must have recognized and realized that surgical gowns, sort of high quality medical equipment that is either flexible tubing made out of advanced materials, even ventilators, if you like. A lot of these things, of course, very fundamentally rely on plastics. Of course, quite a bit on durable plastics, but of course also an awful lot of single-use plastics.
Yeah.
I think it's well, if it would help to bring balance to the debate about plastic waste and the role of plastics in society, that would be good. I think we should not be in some sort of told you so mode that we are somehow being vindicated. I do think the whole issue of plastic waste and bringing more circularity to the petrochemical industry is a valid one, and we should solve that. But the sometimes more militant or extreme view on it, like let it all go away because we didn't need it in the first place, hopefully that gets a little bit recalibrated with the experiences that people are going through at the moment.
Right. Well, at some point, what we're going through will end. We don't know whether at this point whether the second wave or the first wave continues. But is it too soon to have some thoughts about what energy markets, oil and gas markets, will look like after this crisis? I mean, and just your view of the oil market and the LNG markets today.
I think it's probably too soon to say, well, this is now how it will look like. But I think there are a few things that we can probably speculate about or already observe or take a view on. So I think everybody who believed that this was going to be a sharp V-type recovery, well, I think they are probably at least doubting whether that would be the case. I've always said this has more uncertainty attached to it than I would like, so it's very hard to see how this plays out, but it's most likely not going to be a V-shaped recovery, and I believe that is what we are seeing at the moment. Of course, we are seeing a resurgence of motor gasoline, particularly in those areas where people don't like to rely too much on public transport, yes. And therefore you will see a little bit more use of personal transport. But in general, I would say energy demand, certainly mobility demand, will be lower, even when this crisis is more or less behind us. Will it mean that it will never recover? It's probably too early to say, but it will have a permanent knock for years. I would think. Right. On gas, the same thing. I do believe that also the knock that we have seen on gas demand is going to stay with us for some time. In the long run, it will gas. I still think has the long-term potential to grow faster than any of the hydrocarbon energy carriers that we have around. But some of it will be inevitably delayed because gas demand that we have missed out will not be made up. A building that wasn't warmed in the last winter will not be warmed doubly the next winter. So that's obvious. But at the same time, I also believe that that investments are adjusted either because of the sheer availability of cash, the affordability, the risk aversion that companies like ourselves will have for some time. Can I really go ahead with this investment program, or do I want to wait a little bit longer? So that has a balancing effect, obviously. And I believe that, particularly on the gas side, many of the investments that actually looked quite strong, certainly, say, North American LNG projects, and now all of a sudden don't look as strong anymore. And I would think that, therefore, even though demand has been postponed, supply has been postponed in equal measure. Right. So how will that all play out? And finally, balanced markets, it's always hard to make detailed predictions. But I do think that for a few years, we will see a resettling and a recalibration in which also consumer attitudes around travel, around personal mobility, around stepping into an airplane again, will also be a factor that we should not discount.
Yeah. So, I was just thinking as you were saying that, the head of Shell almost exactly a century ago said it was the beginning of the century of travel. And now we'll see a century in which people will reevaluate travel in ways and do more electronically. So Ben, you mentioned before about companies that focus on financial resilience. Shell has taken two big decisions in the last recent period. One was a significant cut in your dividend, and the second is quite a big write-down. How has that worked out? What's been the response of investors?
Well, I think of course, the write-down we have sort of pre-announced. We are still working very much on what exactly the write-down amount is. We have until the end of this month when we have our Q2 results. But as we normally give an update at the end of the quarter, we felt we had to highlight that something like this was coming, and it still had a range in it. It could be as much as $22 billion post-tax, so it will be a major number. On that one, I think investors understand that if you indeed lower your outlook for oil and gas prices, refining margins particularly, but also some other margins, that of course some assets that were already under pressure in terms of their valuation on the balance sheet could be at risk of being impaired. And that's what happened. I think that's not the only one. It's a normal, shall we say, event. Of course, the magnitude is not normal. But then, of course, the magnitude of the disruption and the reset is not normal either. Right. The fact that it's non-cash is of course helpful, so people know that it may have all sorts of balance sheet effects, but it's not going to have an effect on the operational coverage and the coverage of dividends, right, etc. The dividend was a big deal, and it was a big deal for everybody. It was a big deal for me as well.
That must have been a hard decision to come to.
It's a very hard decision, and of course you could see, and maybe you have been one of the commentators as well, who talked about a dividend reduction that hadn't been done since World War II. There was
I observed that others did mention that. Yes.
Okay. Well, it's an iconic dividend. It was the largest dividend in the world. Many people had commented on it in years before, and it's of course something that Dan, you don't do these things lightly. No CEO wants to be the CEO that got the dividend. But then on the other hand, if you are being hit by a crisis like this, if you are seeing that at risk is going to be the long-term financial resilience of the company, and if you see that even though you take very significant measures to preserve the financial resilience of the company, we took $5 billion out of our capital program, we take up to $4 billion out of our operating cost program, a few $1 billion of working capital. So here we are talking about $10 billion a year. If you then still see that carrying on with this dividend would mean ever more gearing, ever more net debt, or even further measures to slash the capital program, to reduce the operating cost, and with it, of course, reduce capability as well. At some point in time, it actually also becomes an easier decision, because I thought, and the board with me, by the way, of course, this was a board decision, we felt that continuing a payout of close to $15 billion a year would not serve the long-term interests of these same shareholders. And you could even argue that it would not have been responsible to borrow that entire amount and in the process reduce the financial strength of the company. In the end, we know that this will pass. We don't know when and how, but what I do know that when it does pass, I want to emerge as a company which has its financial resilience intact and is well positioned for whatever it is that comes next. And we could only do that by taking the measures that we have taken.
So let me ask you two questions that flow from that. One, what has been the response of the investor community that, of course, as you said, followed the iconic dividend? And two, what are you going to do with the money?
Well, let me take the second one first, then. Because that question has been asked quite a few times. And let me just point out that we don't have the money. And so I've heard this so many times, you now have $10 billion. What are you going to do with it? Well, this was $10 billion that we didn't have in the first place. So the only thing
that makes it easier.
So the only thing that I'm not going to do with the $10 billion is borrow it.
Right.
But that's the only thing. It's not as if all of a sudden we have $10 billion lying around. We have $10 billion less debt as a result of this,
right.
On an annualized basis. On the reactions, I think there's a few that would say, yeah, I get it. It's the right thing to do. We thought your dividend was too high anyway. You were not being rewarded for it. You could see this in your dividend yield. So right on you to do it. And now actually the company has many more options.
Right.
I'll be honest, Dan, that's a minority. There is also a minority that says, this is terrible, you should never have done this, and now I can never really trust you as a management again. That is a minority as well. And then there is a reasonably good group of people in the middle that on the one hand understands it, on the other hand didn't quite understand why did we have to do this in Q1, and why did we have to do a 2/3 reduction in the dividend. And I spent more time explaining and talking and listening with investors in the aftermath of that decision. And I think we had a good calibration of appreciation on both sides of the debate. And for me, it was quite simple. The moment you know, and we did know in March and April, that the dividend was under a wide range of scenarios not going to be safe, I think it is not tenable to stand up in front of investors and to say, don't worry about the dividend.
Right.
That actually could be misleading even. The alternative of saying, well, I'm not so sure about the dividend is probably even worse. Right. Because you get punished and then you get punished again if you, in the end, have to reduce it. So the moment you know that this decision in a wide range of scenarios is inevitable, better deal with it. And you better deal with it also from a position of strength. If you reduce the dividend in order to preserve your financial resilience, then you better do it when there is still the maximum financial resilience to preserve. So I think there's more understanding of that now that we've had that sort of clarification and discussion.
And of course, there's never been a disruption on this scale in this industry, or really, you'd have to look to a war for a disruption of the global economy like this. There's no precedent in markets for this.
That's right, Dan. And for those people who were still relatively early on in the sort of appreciation of what this all means, there were quite a few people who said, well, gosh, by Q2 at least you know exactly what it is that you have to deal with, and then you either cut or you don't cut or do whatever you think you need to do, etc. Well, we are at the end of Q2,
right?
And to be perfectly honest, I would like to challenge everybody or anybody who says, well, there's a lot of clarity now. I think we have no more clarity than we had in March.
Right.
And that's exactly what I had foreseen. And that's why we thought, deal with it when you know it's inevitable to deal with it.
Right, and get it done.
And get it done.
Right. So clarity about the future. Let me turn to the farther future. You gave an extraordinary speech in April 16th of this year, in the middle of the crisis, talking about the crisis around COVID, but also talking about Shell's long-term ambition to be a net zero carbon company by 2050. It's a big ambition, as you said in the speech. Tell us how your thinking has evolved to get you to this point.
Well, it's a big ambition. It's a long way out, by the way. So in addition to having an ambition on 2050, we've also sharpened the ambition that we have for 2035. And of course, as you may know, Dan, we have short-term targets as well that are actually not ambitions, they're targets.
Yeah, I can see that.
Salary is linked to that, or remuneration is linked to that outcome as well. But we didn't sit there in January and said, well, now that we are in the middle of this pandemic, why don't we look for some entertainment and do something else? This was with us already, of course, for a long time. We had been thinking about where do we need to go to with the company. We had ambitions set for 2035 and for 2050. We had been in dialogues with investors and with other commentators on the company who felt that we needed to do more, and we ourselves also felt that we needed to make sure that we were completely aligned with Paris. And in the process, that sort of went maybe 6 or 8 months ahead of that April announcement. I think we got a lot more personal clarity about what it would mean to be Paris compliant. And first of all, we said we can't anymore be a 2 degrees C company. We have to be a 1.5 degrees C company. And then we said, well, if you think about what 1.5 degrees centigrade means, it actually comes down that you are net zero by 2050. Actually, the world can probably be net zero by 2060, but if you are a European company, so you work in an advanced economies need to be ahead of the curve when it comes to carbon neutrality. So the EU setting a target of carbon neutrality by 2050, the UK, we felt that we had to do something similar. And then you have to find out how you're going to get there. And what we did is we looked very much at the work that was done by the IPCC, the 1.5 degree centigrade special report, looked at all the curves and how the energy system needed to evolve, what needed to happen. We took the extremes away, the extremely positive or extremely negative views, or the views with sort of extreme technology solutions, and we came out with a pathway that actually reasonably well coincided with our own pathways, and said, well, that is what we need to achieve. It means that we have to obviously be net zero on our own emissions. It means that we have to reduce the carbon content of our energy products to be in line with what society needs to be by 2050, according to the IPCC 1.5 degree special report. That meant a roughly 2/3 reduction in carbon intensity of our product portfolio. And then, of course, the whole world needs to be net zero. So we said that means that whatever carbon we still have in our energy mix needs to work with customers who can deal with that carbon. So customers that can either mitigate, or customers that will rely on us to mitigate the emissions for them.
And that's the famous scope. That's the famous scope 3.
Yes. Yeah. So in aggregate, the scope 3 is also, of course, the carbon content in the products we sell. Yeah, because that is going to automatically result in principle carbon or greenhouse gas production, but then actually mitigating that greenhouse gas production is one of the extra conditions that we put on our supply chain. So in other words, from the wellhead to the end use of all the energy products that we will be selling in 2050, there should be zero emissions. Zero emissions in our operations, zero emissions in the manufacture of the product, zero emissions associated with the energy product as such, and zero emissions on a net basis from its use. I think that it is indeed a wide-ranging ambition, but I think it's the only way, in my mind, that a company like us can stand up and say, we are Paris compliant.
So let me ask you, was this an evolution in your thinking, or were there certain decisive moments when you said, we've really got to pivot in this direction?
I think a bit of both, I would say, Dan. You may remember we were the first ones to come with a Scope 3 commitment or ambition for 2050. We were the first ones to have a net carbon footprint concept. I think at that point in time, it very much modeled it on what we thought would be a less than 2 degrees C outcome. And what we also felt when we laid it out for our investors and for the community, or for the society in general, we felt that it was difficult to get. It took us quite a bit of time to explain what a net carbon footprint is and what about these Scope 3 emissions. And at the time, we said we would halve the net carbon footprint of our energy products. And I think we we had quite a bit of debate and also internal a bit of debate. How do we make sure that people really get it, that this is what a progressive company can and should do? And at some point in time in that discussion, I felt that we're not going to win the debate until we make a definitive statement that we want to be a net zero energy emissions business. Because a lot of discussion was about, this is an intensity metric, is an absolute metric, what about the emissions of your customers, etc. And in the end, the only way to deal with it is to say zero is zero. It doesn't really matter how you calculate it or how you ratio it or not ratio it. Absolute relative, zero is zero. We want to be a company that is zero in terms of the emissions associated with its business. Can't be clearer than that. Of course, we have to still explain it all, but I believe there is a certain degree of finality to the commitment or the ambition that we have now made.
As you say, zero is zero. Obviously over the last few years, there's been a real shift among investors. What's been the response of the investment community and engagement with the investment community with Shell's moving in this direction?
I think on the whole, I would say positive. But there is quite a bit of a spread and a range of views out there. I do believe that investors are hampered by the fact that, of course, many companies have come with claims that they are Paris compliant, have their own ways of demonstrating it or putting ambitions and targets and everything else out there. And there is therefore a certain degree of decoding that investors have to do. Is the Shell claim the same as the claim of this company, and who is better or worse or whatever? I think we have to help investors by, as an industry, being a lot more calibrated in our approach. So the more we can harmonize, the better it will be for investors to understand.
I noticed that one thing you focused on is metrics, getting the metrics right, that there are too many different metrics floating around.
That's right. And that, I think, unless we have done that, I think it will be very, very difficult for investors to really come up with a definitive view about what is good and what is bad or what needs more or less. Of course, there are some investors who think it's great, and that's exactly what we needed, and are now, of course, looking for all the proof points, how we would make that pivot in our investment program, in our product portfolio, to actually deliver on this. So, more low carbon electricity, biofuels, hydrogen. Show me, let me see how you're going to do it. And then there are also on the other end of the spectrum investors who believe that this is a recipe for value destruction. And these investors have to be convinced of a different set of arguments, namely that we can and we should have confidence that we can invest in these technologies and in these value chains of the future, while we still preserve the attractiveness of us as an investment.
So there are two phrases that I notice occur in your remarks a lot. One is in step with society, and the other is license to operate. And I think it'd be useful for you to just say those concepts seem to matter a lot in your thinking.
Yeah, they do, Dan. And in step with society, again, that is quite often understood, but also sometimes we draw criticism for it. The criticism tends to come from those at that end of the spectrum who believe that we should have a leading role. We should just do whatever we think is right, whether society is ready for it, yes or no. And of course, that doesn't work. You can get a little bit ahead of your customers. You can, of course, try to bring your customers along. But ultimately, if your customers are not ready to take your products of the future, then you have to pace your development accordingly. So does that mean that we can sit on our hands and say, well, whenever society is ready, we will be there on the day? No, I don't think so. I think we need to push and pull. And that's why we have very much focused our strategy going forward on a sectorial understanding. So what are the sectors of the economy needing to do to get to net zero, and what sort of business models and what sort of value propositions flow from that? And that will be our business and our value propositions.
Right. I want to come to those, but maybe just ask you a question about society. the society that you live in, which is young people, your own children. What are you hearing about, kind of the next generation's view towards this industry?
Well, I think the societal license to operate is integral to the success. It's one of our three ambitions, but actually all these ambitions hang together. I do not believe you can be a successful company in terms of an investment case if society doesn't carry you, or if you don't carry society. I do not believe you can have an energy transition where you want to be a company of the future if society actually sees you as a company of the past and doesn't buy it that a company like you should have a future. So therefore, these things are integral to each other. And yes, indeed, society does have a critical view of our industry. Quite often, of course, we can sit here and bemoan ourselves and just say society is wrong on this, and society doesn't see all the wonderful things we do, and society doesn't understand how integral the provision of energy is to the lifestyle that they themselves are leading or at least aspiring to, etc., etc. But then my view is these types of bemoanings, if there is such a word, that don't really help. The reality is society indeed sometimes has a somewhat simplistic view of our sector, our companies, the things that we do, and we have to just say, how do we change the narrative around us? And that doesn't mean that we have to be pedantic and say, you better listen up. It means that we have to deliver different types of proof points.
Right. Well, let me just, in the last few minutes we have, ask you about the components of the business. Clearly, you're going to remain in the oil and gas business. That's not going away. But what are the new elements of the business that you're going to be in that will really move those goals along?
Well, first of all, Dan, you're absolutely right. We will be, and maybe I should split it out. We will be in the oil business going forward. As a matter of fact, we believe that oil will have a very significant role to play for a long time to come, and that profitable investments can be made in the oil sector. But it does mean that we're going to be even more selective on where it is that we want to put our money to work. We always had an approach of value over volume. And now that is going to be even more a high grading of the quality type of discussion going forward. So yes, we will be in the oil sector, but it will be, in my mind, it has to be the best oil company, if you like, that we can be on that path. I think gas will continue to be an important sector going forward, and we do believe that growth there is going to be with us for some time. We do believe that gas is not just a bridging fuel, but also a destination fuel. And we believe that we have a lot of capability to offer, a lot of capability to also enjoy. And therefore, we will continue to invest in the growth of that sector for some time to come. At some point in time, it will peak as well, I would imagine then, but that is a little bit further into the future. And then the other energy businesses. So think of electricity, think of biofuels, think of hydrogen, but also think of the other tools that we can have in the toolkit, like nature, to mitigate the intrinsic carbon footprint of our products, or carbon capture and storage. Yes, these will be business opportunities for us as well, but they will be rolled very much in with a stronger focus on the customer, because I believe the energy system of the future is going to be an energy system where the value is created much closer to the customer than it is created closer to the resource. And therefore, a company with a strong brand, which we have, but also with the ability to integrate value propositions for customers and to have a focus on the sectorial approach that I just mentioned. So really understanding in the different sectors of the economy, what are the energy needs and how do we create business opportunities out of it, I think is going to be the winning proposition going forward.
Well, so within those couple of elements, and just to kind of pin them down a little bit, electricity, do you have a clear view what you'll do in electricity, or is that still evolving?
No. I think that view is conceptually and more than conceptually quite clear. We want to be an integrated power player. So that means that we need to be having positions in generation, but also positions in the customer end and also positions in the middle. We believe it needs to be dominantly green, and we believe that we need to integrate these positions with the other energy vectors that we have. Because in the end, again, the value is going to be had from integrating energy offerings at the customer end and being able to play a sophisticated arbitrage game when it comes to electrons and molecules and other ways of interacting between the different components of the energy ecosystem. We have a unbelievably good capability when it comes to trading and optimization of our own networks. And I think that is going to be a key component to success for us going forward, also in the power sector. And we believe that as that system evolves and needs to attract billions, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of investment.
Trillions. Trillions.
Indeed. That investment is only going to come forward if indeed attractive returns are going to be made. I think we have a really good recipe for playing and winning in that sector, and therefore we want to not pass up on the biggest thing in energy in the future that is going to be around, which is electricity.
Well, of course, I mean, as you say, trillions of dollars, and one of the things that we're very interested in is, of course, the supply chains that have to be created. So there's a lot of opportunity for investment in that. There are two areas I want to ask you about investment, and before we conclude. One is 4 or 5 years ago, hydrogen was sort of out there on the periphery. Hydrogen has really become a very central part of the discussion now. Why is that?
I think hydrogen is, of course, I remember when we started up Shell Hydrogen in the late 90s. We thought it was about to take off as well, and we were sort of almost congratulating ourselves that we got this one right in terms of timing. And then, of course, here we are more than 20 years later, and it's, again, just about to take off.
You're right.
So it is tough to call these things right, and it takes a tremendously long time, Ben. I don't have to tell you that, getting from the first commercial application of a technology to it being 1% of the energy mix tends to take 25 years in our sector. Something that, of course, a lot of people overlook. But it's a pretty reliable development statistic. I think for hydrogen, maybe things are different at this point in time. I do think the technology has evolved quite a bit. I think the concept of green hydrogen is starting to come within reach. I think governments are really wisening up to the idea that many of the energy transition plays that they have in mind, hydrogen needs to play an integral role, because it's not all going to be electrification. We will have to have some molecules for, say, a very heavy duty mobility demand, or for high temperature heat, or even for space heating that can be done quite efficiently with hydrogen. So I do believe policymakers are beginning to see the need for this. And I begin to see also the role that hydrogen will play as a storage component, a long-term transportation component, et cetera, et cetera. Does it mean that hydrogen will be the next big thing in the next 5 years? I don't think so. But I do believe that those companies who set themselves up to succeed in that area and can make the right type of investments and can, again, seed and develop the hydrogen markets of the future are going to be the long-term winners. And we have every intention to be just that.
So does Shell Hydrogen still exist, or has it been reborn?
It has been reinvented a few times, but it is very much alive and kicking. And I would like to say that even though we are, of course, not the largest hydrogen company in the world, that is very much, what industrial gas companies are. But in terms of hydrogen for mobility or hydrogen for other uses than just the, shall we say, refining or petrochemical or industrial use, we are indeed amongst the leading, if not the leading player. Right. It's small, but it's nevertheless a position of leadership that we are maintaining and that we want to build out as much and as fast and as reliably as we can.
So I'd like to ask you about one new cutting edge technology that's very much at the future that you mentioned. It's called nature. And you mentioned nature as part of the package. What does that mean?
Yeah, I think it's, we know that one way or other, by the time we get to 2050 or 2060, whatever time frame you want to call for this, and we want to be as a planet to be carbon neutral, we know that there will have to be some mitigation of emissions as well. Of course, some segments of society believe that we can get to being zero by just eliminating all carbon from the energy system. In reality, that most people, including the IPCC for that matter, and everybody who has studied the energy system, understands that there will still be a proportion of carbon in the energy system. So one way or other, we will have to deal with that. You can deal with it if it is a large stationary source of greenhouse gases. You can capture and sequester and do things like this. Hopefully even use the carbon. But the more diffuse ones, think of air travel, we still will have carbon in the air travel mix by 2050, is my prediction. We will have to find other ways of capturing that. Okay, the idea of direct air capture and having large mechanical facilities doing that is interesting, and I think we should work on that, and I do believe there is scope for that. But we should not forget that our planet, of course, has invented a much better, more durable system, which is called trees.
Right.
But it all needs to be trees, or whether it can be something else, and there's many different ways in which nature can capture and sequester carbon. I do believe there is a major role for that part to play. It will be difficult because, again, people can, with justification, ask themselves, how reliable is it? Is all the carbon that's going to be sequestered in nature, is it going to stay sequestered? How do I rely on these companies doing the right thing? Is there enough sequestration capacity on this planet? And if there isn't one, who should actually use this? Should this be used by agriculture, or can industry use it? And these are all real issues that we need to address. But we cannot wait for them to be resolved before we start using nature. And that's why we are just moving ahead.
Right. Well, as a last question, let me just ask you that we're in a period now when the word unprecedented has taken on new meaning in this COVID era. I wanted to ask you just about the response of all the people around the world who work for Shell, how you've seen them cope with the situation and continue to do their jobs and contribute to their communities.
Well, thanks, Dan. That's a really important question as well, because I do believe that the response of our company, and I realize we're not the only company who can make claims like this, but I happen to be the CEO of Shell. The response of people in our company has been absolutely fantastic. And whether I talk about our ability to keep everything going, our ability for the organization to step up in a different way in working with colleagues and to make sure that colleagues are looked after, are given allowance, are being brought in, are being helped in whatever way that they need support and help, is actually incredibly inspiring. And then on top of it, what we've also seen is that everybody has gone above and beyond the call of duty to also reach out into their communities. How do we make the most of this crisis as human beings with some of the resources of the company behind them? So I think hats off to our employees. They are the biggest source of inspiration that I've had over the last months. And I'm incredibly proud as to what we have achieved through our employees. So a big thank you to all of them.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Ben, for this very wide-ranging conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, and we appreciate the opportunity to be with you.
Thank you, Dan.
Yeah. I've been talking with Ben van Beurden, who's the CEO of Royal Dutch Shell. We've covered a lot of ground from how companies operate and how Shell operates in this COVID era, how the people within Shell have responded to the changing energy markets, and to Shell's goal of net zero carbon and how to achieve it. Thank you very much for joining us for the CERAWeek conversation brought to you by IHS Markit.